Hey guys, I'm gonna kind of go through a little bit of how we're going to use Google Classroom and then get you started on the first unit. When you open up Classroom in the upper corner, however yours looks, you're going to click on Health 3B and you'll click on Classwork at the top. You notice as you look down, you'll have a personal feedback sheet here at the top. That's just where I'm going to give you all sorts of different feedback. I may even make comments about how you're doing in class, things like that. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but you can take a look at that if you want to. Below that's the syllabus. So if you need to go back and review anything, expectations, standards, things like that we're going to be doing in class, feel free to open that up. And then below that, you'll start seeing our units, and I will adjust these up and down so that currently lifestyles is at the top, but our next unit is life skills, so that will actually show up on the top of the next one. I'll adjust that down as we continue on. Just below that as well are some of the assignments that we start off, and I'll always go ahead and list the day. So that today's class is day 3, and I've got the PowerPoint that we'll be going through here in a minute, and the definition sheet, and I'll go ahead and kind of open both of those up. So the PowerPoint here is right here, and so you can see it over here on the left. I've got different sheets, and you're going to notice something on the PowerPoint that I'll probably explain a little bit here in a minute. But at the top on each one of these, I actually have the objective that I would like for you to pay attention to. It's our goal for the day, your goal for actually going through this specific lesson. And it changes colors from one day to the next. It's really when the objective changes. So you'll notice that as you go through that as well. I have a definition sheet. This isn't something that's got a due date on it. It's something that you'll continue to do. It is something that I expect you to do. People who do this do really well on the test because they have an idea of what the terms are and the definitions. Anytime during the PowerPoint that you see a word that is highlighted in blue, and here's an example here, so lifestyle disease, you will open up the definition sheet, and on that definition sheet you can enter the term, write the definition down, and we'll use this as a way to quiz each other throughout the semester. So continuing on, I'm going to go ahead and open up the PowerPoint as the objective. And our first objective is I can understand lifestyle disease and controllable versus uncontrollable risk factors. I'll get into a little bit more about what that means so you have an understanding. The next thing I would like for you to do is go back to Classroom and open up the Health IQ quiz. So it's the third thing down the list. You'll click on this, open up the quiz, and go ahead and take this. So if you need to go ahead and pause the video at this time, go through and answer some of those questions. All right, now that you're done taking the quiz, go ahead and go to the next slide, and it talks about the definition worksheet. So if you go back to Classroom and open up the definition sheet for lifestyles, and you can start plugging in those terms. So I'm going to go back over the PowerPoint and really get into the point of this unit. There's 4 questions that you're going to have to be able to answer on the test at the end of this unit. And I've got them here on this next slide, so it's on slide 5 if you need to refer back to that. First question is, what is the leading cause of death? Or what were the leading causes of death from 100 years ago? And then down below that, why are the causes from 100 years ago no longer leading causes? So those two relate to each other. And then in regards to today, what is the leading cause of death now? And then what has happened in the last 50 years, really, to cause these new leading causes of death? So we'll get into those. So the first question I had on there, so what were the leading causes of death 100 years ago? And our next slide has some answers. And these are just some examples. And really, if you go back further in history, you've got things like the plague, scarlet fever. You've got all sorts of things that killed hundreds of thousands of people in our nation's history early ago. But really, I'm just going back to 100 years ago because in the last 100 years, things medically have changed quite a bit for us. Beyond that time, there really wasn't a whole lot of change between 1900 and the end of the 18th century. So as we take a look at just some leading causes of death here, some of these you've heard of, some of them you haven't. What I can tell you is that there's a reason why you don't really see these anymore, which is our next slide. Why are they gone away? So a real quick example or story that I always give in class is I remember when my son, who is now in elementary school, was born. In the first 6 months to 9 months, we were taking him to his pediatrician and we were getting vaccines taken. And if you look back on these slides, I remember them talking about some of these specific actual vaccinations that he's taking. So it's not that these diseases don't exist anymore. It's just that we now have a vaccination for these. When you have a small child who's 6 months, 9 months, even up to a year, 18 months, they're getting vaccinations for these things in a sequential order. But if you look at what our country has really developed is vaccinations and antibiotics really to help combat some of these things. So some of these diseases were killing people by the hundreds of thousands. It was not uncommon for you to look over your classmate that's near you and then notice a few weeks later that they're not there anymore because they had passed away of some sort of disease. So what's incredible in our day and age is that now we don't have to worry about those things because of the vaccinations, the advancements in medicine, obviously surgery, things like that. So those are the big reasons why, going back to this question back up here on slide 6, what were the leading causes of 100 years ago? We talked about those just a second ago, and then the reason why they no longer exist is for one of those essentially 3 reasons. So moving on from here, what are the new leading causes of death, like within the last 50 years? And this is a difficult topic to kind of really wrap our heads around because a lot has changed. Some things for the better, but in many ways not necessarily the case. So again, I'll put up this slide that has the 100 years ago diseases on the left side, but now we add in today's diseases. And just if you take a look at that, there is a common trend that we'll really hit into here in a minute as to what's going on. So then why have the new problems arrived? And it's really one thing: lifestyles have changed. If you look back over here, you'll really we'll come back to the slide here in a little bit, you'll really start to get an idea of things that are in our control and things that are not. And things over here on the left-hand side of this, they're not in our control. People were dying of that. It was because of disease was spreading from hand-to-hand combat, bacteria in the air, all sorts of things. Over here, those things aren't really things that we have. Now, there's certainly things that can be spread, and we mentioned STDs up here, but that is a choice versus over here, not necessarily. So when we continue on here, so lifestyles have changed. What I mean when I say that, it's really the choices in a sense that people are making. So on this slide here, I've really got the reasons breaking down what's going on. So these are lifestyle choices that I have listed on here. These are things that are in your control and things that people are doing to increase the leading causes of death to today. And we'll get into what specifically those are. There's a couple of different age ranges that we're going to look at. So what is a lifestyle disease specifically? And when you take a look at this, when you're entering on the definition on the sheet, the very first part here, anything that's not in parentheses or the first deal, that's all I want you to write. So this particular disease is something that is caused partially by unhealthy behaviors and partially by other factors. And an example of this would be taking a genetic issue and potentially making it worse. And there's an example down there below that you can read. So lifestyle disease is something that is caused by your own behavior, your own choices. The next definition we're going to add in here is risk factor. So as you're doing this, again, remember that you can go back to Classroom, open up the definition sheet, and you're typing this in right here. So you would go through and put those in. And you can, again, pause the video anytime you need to, going on through that. So risk factor is anything that increases the likelihood of injury, disease, or any other kind of health problem, or potentially even death. So if you're speeding down the highway at 110 miles an hour, that's obviously increasing the potential risk that you might have. There's a 0% chance of drowning if you're not in water, just for example. So the risk increases when you get into water. The risk increases if you're driving a vehicle fast by the faster that you drive. So you can kind of get an idea what that risk factor might be. And then we'll jump in at a couple other definitions here. Controllable behaviors and uncontrollable factors. So something that you can choose or that's your choice, that's obviously a controllable behavior. An uncontrollable factor is something that's predetermined and that you have no control of, or it's something that happens to you that was not in your control. An example here is our genetic makeup. So if I go back up and I pull up these diseases from 100 years ago or what's going on today, for example, tuberculosis was something in the early 1900s that really killed a lot of people, and it's something that they had no remedy for at the time, really, until they created a vaccine for it. And so it was out of their control. People were losing their kids or family members just constantly over this disease. But tuberculosis today is something that is somewhat controllable. There are people that very rarely can die from this, but it's usually because they didn't have the vaccine when they were young, and they didn't have the vaccine as an adult when they got the disease. So it's something that is preventable now. Versus today, for example, obesity. That's not something that just jumped up and snuck up on somebody. So I didn't just wake up one day and they were 120 pounds overweight. It's something that happened over time based on multiple choices that they made in their own lifetime. Diabetes, type 1 diabetes is uncontrollable, but type 2 diabetes, which is obesity onset diabetes, is controllable. And then I know you guys answered a question in the quiz about heart disease, and heart disease can be in some way related to genetics, and a lot of people feel that way, but really heart disease is something that can be prevented. It's something that has a lot to do with physical activity and the food intake that you have. And then MVA down here just is short for motor vehicle accidents. And we'll get into that a little bit more in the next lesson, but the majority of motor vehicle accidents could be prevented just based off of choices that we're making while we're in the vehicle. Again, so going back to the difference between controllable and uncontrollable is really the difference between 100 years ago and today. So the reason why I have you guys, again, putting on these definitions in the definition sheet is that when you come back to answer these questions on the test, and you'll have to type these in paragraph form, is that people that use these terms, lifestyle disease, risk factor, controllable behaviors, uncontrollable factors, people that use those terms do better on the test. They have a better understanding of explaining. You're going to sound more intelligent when you're going through and giving answers. It's something that's important for you to use terms in terms of defense, how you explain your answer. So some other examples as I continue on of controllable versus uncontrollable here on the next slide. The way that you're born, the way that you look, those things are uncontrollable. But in terms of how much physical activity you have on a daily basis, whether or not you choose to smoke, how heavy you are, and potentially even tomorrow, things like that, how you eat, all of those things are in your control, things that you have choices over. So as we kind of pause here for a second, I'm going to have you go back to Classroom, and you're going to open up a Day 3 Controllable Factors quiz. When you open this up, you're going to be asked a bunch of questions like, oh, I don't really know what this is. So I'll just kind of walk you through the first question here. So for someone who is 100 pounds overweight, what does their current physical activity look like? So if I'm 100 pounds overweight, chances are I'm not doing much of anything. So working out 3 to 5 days a week, no way. I don't have to read the rest of that option because there's no way they're doing that. Okay, working out 1 to 2 days a week, probably not. Okay, so down here, the last two notes, working out 0 days a week. Okay, someone who's 100 pounds overweight, that's probably what's going on. Okay, and they rarely ever get any moderate to physical activity. Working out 0 days but does not get at least 30 minutes of moderate daily activity. That's probably down here in this range. That's probably where I would go on this question. The rest of the questions down here, I'm not looking for you to have a complete understanding of what's going on, but I want you to keep in mind that someone who is very overweight needs a small change. So when we go back to this quiz and we're talking about controllable behaviors, if you were 100 pounds overweight, you probably wouldn't want someone coming in and telling you need to run 5 miles. So starting with something very simple, just as walking, or doing something like, instead of eating 15 meals out a week, eating 11 out a week. So making a small change is going to be what's most beneficial for people like this. So I want you to go through and answer those questions as best you can. After that, there's another quiz, and you can go ahead and click on that as well. So when you're done with that one, and that controllable factor is only like 5 or 6 questions. There's an exit ticket quiz, and I'll open this up as well. And this is only like 3 or 4 questions. And on this one, it's going to ask you the difference between controllable and uncontrollable, and you're going to have to actually select which ones are controllable, which ones are not, so based off of the question. So answer those, and that'll be the end of this particular lesson. So, all right, good luck.